Morning, Paul.
Morning, Tom. How are you?
I'm doing fine. Thanks for joining us this morning. This is the kickoff to our series of podcasts on selection and trying to improve that entire process. And I thought we'd start with you because I think of you always as being someone who's been at the forefront of trying to work with organizations about understanding their processes and what are the specifications, the inputs and expected outputs. And of course, you learned all this at the knee, I would say, of Edwards Demings, who current generation probably doesn't remember all that well, but those of us who are a certain age do. And his contributions were fantastic. And you've been building on those here in Thailand, helping people with ISO certifications and other things. So I thought your perspective is particularly useful when we start talking about selection. It's where do you start, and where do you start tends to be with specifications, and then defining the process. So, if you wouldn't mind, I'd like to just pick your thoughts about how do people start out with specifications.
Well, thanks, Tom. I appreciate the time being able to sit here and talk about something that I think is extremely important with any organization that tries to satisfy customers, meet current specifications, deal with different country regulatory requirements, and they always look at what is it that we really need in order to become profitable, be able to satisfy our customers. And they look at things like, well, do I have financing? Well, that's important. Do I have the equipment that I
Right.
need? Do I have all of this stuff? But the one very important thing that people don't think about as much as they should is having the right people at the right job at the right time.
Right.
As you mentioned, for the past 30 plus years, we've been helping companies in Thailand develop management systems on quality and environment and health and safety and automotive and aerospace. But in every one of those ISO standards,
Right.
there is one particular clause these days, 7.2, in case anybody wants to look it up, and it talks about resources. And in order for a company to be successful, it has to identify three areas of resources: infrastructure,
Right.
important; the environment, important; but people, competent people who know their job and know how to apply the skills and knowledge that they have to make the process work. Now, every organization has a process, step by step by step by step by step. And in order for those processes to work, there is an input to the process.
Right.
People don't really think about, how do I measure and monitor the input to the process to make sure that it's going to help me accomplish what I want to accomplish? So now we start at the very beginning. Do I have the right people that I can rely on in order to do the job that I need to do? Now, many times organizations say, well, that's just an overhead activity. It's not going to really affect my production. It's not going to affect my bottom line profitability. But the fact of the matter is, if we don't accurately identify the people that we need, find the specifications that are important for them to do the job in skills and knowledge, and be able to apply that, it's going to cost the company money.
Right.
Bottom line, they're going to have to rehire, they're going to have to retrain, they're going to have to replace people that may not be able to do the job. And so all of these factors then are very important to organizations that need to be able to identify the processes and measure and monitor the interviewing process to make sure that it's really working.
Right. You know, one of the interesting things you talked about was specifications, and oftentimes when we're working with clients, we ask them what are the qualifications or things you're looking for, and they always mention, well, you know, well, they got to have a university degree from this kind of university, and they need to have 3 or 4 or 5 or 10 years of experience doing this. But they very, very rarely talk about the other things that are really, really important, like do they have the competencies to be able to do it. Just because you've been in marketing in company A doesn't mean you can succeed in marketing in company B. And so a lot of people tend to overlook that. They tend to default to the years of experience versus, do I really understand what Paul is bringing to the party, and does that help me make a better decision? So I think a lot of times people get kind of halfway down the road, but they don't go all the way down the road. The other thing that's important that we've found is that the people who are involved in the interviewing need to all have a consensus or alignment on what is it that we're looking for. Without that, you get organizations that got three different people. Yeah, they have three different people interviewing, but they don't necessarily agree on what the specifications are, and they wander off, making their own decisions. And it gets to be very difficult for them to make a decision because they're not aligned on specifications. And I mean, I think the same thing is true, and I've heard you talk about it before, with anything that is being manufactured. If you don't have the people in purchasing and production and quality all lined up on the specifications that are going to go into the product gets too much variability.
That's very true. And in fact, my old boss, Dr. Deming, said in a TV interview back in 1983, he said, managers don't even know the right questions to ask. And if they don't know the right questions to ask, of course, they're never going to get the answers that they really need. The interesting thing about specifications, back in the previous versions of our ISO standards, it said, well, we need to have people who have been trained. Well, they found out that having people trained was not necessarily the absolute necessity that somebody should have. Then the standard said, well, we need to have people who are competent. They need to be able to really do the task. And I think you bring up a very good point, is that if you're going to be interviewing somebody and they're going to be responsible for doing a particular task, then have the individuals who are involved with that activity to be able to ask the relevant questions that would identify the knowledge and skills that the person has. You're not going to have the manager of the finance department talking to a quality engineer who's going to be looking at quality specifications on the line,
right,
because that's not a relevant role for them. So it's important then to really identify the specification for the employee that you're trying to hire, have the right people who have that knowledge and skills to be able to ask the relevant questions so that you can make a competent decision. Is this individual one that's going to really help us do the job?
Right. And to build on that point, I think a lot of organizations don't necessarily involve the hiring manager and the hiring manager's team. Sometimes they have HR involved in it. Sometimes they have, somebody in finance involved in it. And the importance of having the people who would wind up working with the candidate directly involved, being trained as interviewers and doing the interviewing, helps build a bond between the candidate and the people that eventually they would be working with if they were hired. So I think it's extraordinarily important that the people who are doing the interviewing are the 2 or 3 or 4 people who they are primarily going to be working with, and the hiring manager. And without that, then the point you raised is, what does the finance person know about quality or vice versa? So you got to have people who are very familiar with the job, so when they're asking the right questions of the candidate, they can judge, okay, yeah, that kind of behavior is exactly the kind of thing we need to have demonstrated in our environment. And I think that builds confidence and credibility in the selection process.
I think another issue that is important that many times we don't recognize is that individuals who are conducting an interview also need to have the knowledge and skills to be able to bring out of the individual that they're interviewing the information that they need.
Right.
I audit companies on a regular basis, and I teach auditors. And one of the things that we teach auditors is how to ask the questions that are going to give us the answers that we need to make a proper decision
Right.
if this process is working or not. So I think not only do we need to identify the specification for the new employee that we're going to be interviewing, but also to develop within the organization at different functions within the organization, the interviewing skills necessary.
Correct.
How do I ask a question to an individual to get the information? Am I going to ask what we call a closed question, which is a yes or no answer?
Right.
Have you ever worked in this job before? Yes. It doesn't tell you anything.
Right.
But if you ask an open question
Mhm.
to an employee, tell me about the function that you performed at the other company. Now you're going to get some information as to, does this person really know what they're doing? So questioning techniques, how to ask the question to get the information from the individual and allow the individual to talk. You know, the problem is many times interviewers talk too much.
Yes.
They like to hear themselves talk. I'm a very important person. I'm a manager in this company, and I'm going to ask you all the important questions so that I can make a decision if you want to work with us or not. And so the poor person, the interviewee sitting there, is probably wondering, what am I going to do?
Right.
So it's important to train people who are going to be interviewing to ask the right questions so they can find the information that they need.
I couldn't agree more. One of the things that we do when we work with clients is to say, have your people been trained in interviewing?
Mm.
And to your point, a lot of times people don't know the difference between closed and open-ended questions, or theoretical questions. And I always find that theoretical questions are almost useless. If you ask me, for instance, okay, Tom, how would you go about losing weight? And I could rattle off 10 things and tell you these are all the things I could do. And then 3 months later, you come back and say, Tom,
You haven't lost weight.
I don't think it's worked too well. So there's a difference between the theory, kind of having some knowledge about, this is what I should do, and what I actually do. And what we're interested, of course, in is what people actually do. So in training people how to interview, there are two things that we always do. One is we create interview guides so that the questions are in fact open-ended, and they're aimed at exactly the competencies that we want to check or look for. I'd like to, if I can, I'd like to turn to Dr. Fan, who I'm about to introduce. Dr. Fan is a professor of industrial organizational psychology at the University of Auburn in Alabama, and joining us today via Skype. Dr. Fan and I have known each other for about 20 years and worked together through an organization called SIOP, the Society of Industrial Organizational Psychology. We presented together and worked together. I have a lot of respect for him and the research that he brings, and I think he has some respect and admiration for the practical experience that I have. So we found that it's been a pretty good relationship. And one of the things that we do is we build psychometric assessments to help in the interviewing process. And yet, both of us realize and recognize that one of the most important things is being able to identify, as Paul was saying, the specifications or the competencies that people need to demonstrate on the job that really give us the confidence that, oh yes, this person's experience is very relevant. The things that they've done tell me that they've got the right level of confidence, and now I've gained a lot of appreciation for how this person can help in my organization. So Dr. Fan has started his career at China Eastern Normal University in Shanghai in China, and then he came to the United States and went to Ohio State University. So he's a Buckeye, those of you who know the Big Ten. And then he went to his first teaching assignment after getting his PhD was at Hofstra University. And he's been at Auburn now for how long? 15 years?
A little over 12 years.
12 years. Okay. So he's been at Auburn University. He's a full professor there. He's also the editor of several well-respected psychological journals, and he teaches in the graduate program at Auburn. So, and is, by the way, considered to be one of the foremost experts in the world on response fidelity measures in the use of personality assessments. So it's been extraordinarily interesting and valuable to get to know. But today, we just want to talk about competencies if we can. So would you share some of your thoughts about the importance of competencies?
Sure. I have a lot of connections back home in China. My business, a lot of my business happens in China, and I noticed lots of Chinese organizations, whether it's for selection project or training projects, they don't have a criteria as a selection criteria or any kind of specification to start with. Then it's become a unbased project. Nobody knows where it comes, nobody knows where it goes. So nobody knows how you evaluate the work you have done. So, for instance, recently I've been working with an organization for a training project, and they asked me to revamp the training program and do some training program evaluation. I was like, okay, but tell me, well, they have a key position in mind, but tell me, what do you think is the most important specification or key competencies for the success of this job? They couldn't answer the question. I was like, if you could not answer the question, how can you design the training program? How can you purchase the training program? But supposedly, the training program you purchase, the content has to address those key competencies you identified earlier on. But they didn't do job analysis, did not do competency models, so we have nothing. So we ended up saying, I told them, well, if you really want to do it scientifically, we have to start with competency models or job analysis. So I was able to give them the JAQ, and we did a couple of big discussions to identify key competencies and the representative behaviors under each competency. And then we went to their current training modules, and we did a assessment trying to gauge the degree to which the current training program content addresses those 8 competencies. It turns out half of those key competencies were not even addressed in any of the current training programs. So then we identify, oh, you don't even address these areas. How do you expect your training program to be successful? So they are continuing to working with me to develop training modules that specifically address competencies that was not addressed initially.
You know, you bring up a couple of very interesting points, Fan, as you always do. Number one, it's the competencies are extraordinarily important in terms of the specifications that we focus our interviewing on and how we train people how to interview. But also, the competence is something that you take a look at in terms of the training programs or development activities that you assign people to, because we're always trying to develop competencies. And the other thing, of course, is that oftentimes we find a disconnect between the performance appraisals that companies do and the competencies that they tell us are important in selection. In other words, and you and I have talked about this a number of times, why would you look for a person who has these certain competencies because it tells you they can do the job, and then it comes to the performance evaluation and you don't look at that. You have another set of criteria. So there's a misalignment in a lot of organizations between what they're looking for when they hire people, what they're looking for in terms of how they can develop those competencies on the job through either training or development, and how they're assessing that performance towards the end of the cycle. And of course, then that feeds on to talent management as well. So you and I were having a discussion not that long ago about some of the work that was done around selection in the 1990s. So the Hunter and Schmidt research on the validity and reliability of selection methods. And then Hunter and Hunter replicated that. And then you were telling me, which was an article I hadn't even read yet, that they've reproduced it again out of the University of Minnesota. I think it was Paul Sackett's work.
Yeah, Paul Sackett and his colleagues recently published a sort of updated meta-analysis of the validity of selection methods in JAP. They try to address a number of methodological limitations of previous meta-analysis. Basically, they conclude that the selection method that have the highest validity is structured interviews.
Right.
Yeah.
Yeah, and structured interviews, of course, are competency-based interviews. That's exactly what they are. Structured meaning that you are asking open-ended questions, as Paul was referencing, to candidates to ask them to describe the things that they've done in their recent past experience, to be able to relate those examples to what is required of the job. Now, years ago, many years ago, I was first trained in assessment centers. And in assessment centers, what you do is you put people through a series of exercises. So you give them a case study, they read it, and then you ask them questions about, okay, what are you going to do about this? What are you going to do about that? And so these structured interviews that we're talking about now developed out of the assessment center methods and are far less time consuming and costly than putting people through assessment centers. But it's all designed around the same kind of IO psychology best practice. So, one of the things I think that you and I have talked about is that, yes, we have psychometric assessments that we develop, and they are all Big Five based, the most modern types of assessments. We have cognitive ability assessments. You and I also worked on this thing that you mentioned, which is the job analysis questionnaire that helps identify competencies. And still we come back to, even though personality tests and cognitive ability tests are important, we come right back to competencies. And it's just absolutely critically important that people who are doing selection or about to enter into the journey on selection need to understand what are the competencies that we're targeting, and how do we go about doing that. Could you talk a little bit about something like the JAQ or the job analysis process and what happens?
Sure. If you want to do a sort of quicker competency models, JAQ and the review meetings are very important to do. Again, compared with the standardized competency models, it's very time consuming and costly. And Tom and I come up with a sort of quick ways of doing competency models / job analysis. We use a tool called Job Analysis Questionnaire, JAQ. Basically, you need to identify a key position, and you need to get somewhere around 5 to 8 job content experts to complete the JAQ, where the source of these JCEs could come from star performers on the target position and their superiors, direct report, and some very experienced HR people who routinely do recruitment selection on those target positions. So these 5 to 8 JCEs will complete a 135 item JAQ. Each item is a behavior. We present behavior to these JCEs one by one. For each behavior, they are to evaluate how important this behavior is to the success fulfillment of job requirement and how frequently they need to engage in these behaviors. Then the algorithm will generate a JAQ output report, which will allow you to identify the top 12 or 13 competencies based on these surveys. But that's the initial step. 12, 13 competencies are still very difficult to manage in the practical world. So we follow that up with 2 sort of big review panel discussion. In the first panel discussion, the key is to have JCEs to agree on somewhere between 6 to 8 key competencies. So we narrow it down from 12, 13 competencies or important competencies to 6 to 8 key competencies. That's the purpose of the first review meeting. In the second panel discussion, we're going to go through each key competencies identified earlier. So for each competency, we try to ask JCEs to come up with several, representative behaviors. If a candidate can demonstrate those behaviors, we know that person is pretty strong in that competency. We also ask JCEs to identify a couple of sort of incompetent behaviors. If you see candidates demonstrate those incompetency behaviors, we'll also know pretty quickly this person has some issues. This person is not very good as that competencies. So we go
Right.
through these 6 to 8 key competencies and behaviors that actually ends the job analysis project. Then we write it up. We tell our client organization, these are 6 to 8 key competencies, what they are. We have our definition and what they are represented by positive behaviors and negative behaviors. That's the meat part of a job analysis project.
Right. Yeah, and it sounds intensive, and in fact, it is. And one of the things that we find that there are lots of people out there who, over the last 10 years, went out and bought competency models, and they paid a lot of money for them. And when we ask them how do you use the competencies, we find they don't.
Yeah, that's the problem. I've talked to many Chinese organizations. Half of them actually have competency models.
Right.
They were not heavily involved in the competency model process. They don't understand why certain things or certain aspects are done that way or this way. So it's kind of it's a decoration thing, not a real thing. And the JAQ and the two big discussion thing offers a quick job analysis. And because it involves both our consultant and the JCE, which usually is those employees in the client organization, they have great buy-in if they are actively engaged in this process. And we can witness that our JAQ project, once the competency models are developed, it is routinely used by those managers.
Right.
I think the key word that you used, and I heard Paul use the same word, is alignment. If you don't know where you're going, any road will get you there. So if you have people who are involved in the interviewing process or the selection process, if they're aligned on exactly what we're looking for, and they know it when they see it, and they know it when they don't see it, they can make much better decisions, and they can do it in a relatively efficient and fast-paced manner. It doesn't have to take a long time to make a selection decision when you're looking at candidates. And one of our other guests that's going to be coming up in a day or two or so is going to talk about how many interviews you actually need to verify the information. And one of the things that we often find is that there are too many people involved in the selection process. You probably only need 3 or 4, and oftentimes interviewers they'll have 6 or 8 or 10 different interviewers, and they stretch it out over a month. Candidate gets exhausted, they lose interest, and there's not it's too hard to get 10 people who've interviewed somebody to agree on anything. So the decision doesn't get made, it gets deferred, and then HR gets blamed. HR is not giving us good candidates. Well, that's not necessarily the problem. The problem is that the selection process itself is not very well defined, and the people who are involved in the process are not very well aligned. So I think you're absolutely right that process of spending time, and particularly involving the people who are going to be doing the interviewing, making sure that they're the ones who are identifying and understanding the competencies of what they're looking for. It really helps if those are the people who are doing the interviewing. Okay. Anything else you'd like to add?
Not really. I just want to reemphasize everything, in HR, different modules, selection, training is always start with having a clearly specified criteria or specification, because that serves base sets of the basis for all other activities that are to take place, and also provide a good opportunity for evaluation work in the future.
Right. And that's exactly what Paul was saying in his message too. And he's worked with quality over many years. And of course, the lessons that came out of the quality literature was start with specifications, define the
Yes,
Process.
yes, I think Paul and you drove home the point that for selection work, we need to have a selection criterion to start with. The example I provide in the first place is I make the argument the same idea can also be applied to training program kind of work.
Exactly.
Exactly. Okay. I think we've reached the end of our time. So listen, Fan, thank you very much. And Paul, thank you very much for helping us start our journey.
My pleasure.
Thank you. So in our discussions with Paul and Dr. Fan, we covered a number of topics that would give you kind of an overview of what does best practice selection look like, and how do you start to look at it as a process. So we're about to show you what the best practice selection process looks like. It starts on the left-hand side, and that is what best practice selection looks like, with the job analysis, which is a process used to identify the key 8 to 12 competencies that the new hire would have to demonstrate on the job if they were hired. Then the second thing is we need to identify from the hiring manager's team, and they should all be from the hiring manager's team, 2 to 3 interviewers beyond the hiring manager, who should always be included, to train them in behavioral interviewing. And then the other thing that has to happen is that HR and the hiring manager have to agree on what kind of pre-employment tests are going to be used and how they're going to be used. And we always recommend that it should, if they're using a personality assessment, it should be a Big Five-based personality assessment. And if it's not, then don't use it. And the other thing is there may be some other skills tests, whether that's an accounting test or a numerical or abstract reasoning, that would be used to identify certain competencies or capabilities that the new hire would benefit from having coming into that type of position. Then the next step is HR would then create for the hiring manager team 3 to 4 bespoke or customized interview guides with rating scales to help the interviewers cover all the needed areas they need to check with the candidate and be able to successfully rate them using a common rating scale, so that we don't have different people with different ideas of what they're looking for. They're agreed on what the competencies and the requirements are, and they're interviewing for those things. Then the other thing is that during that time of creating the interview guides, they also create an interview guide to screen the candidates. When they go out to the candidate pools, they have to screen in candidates who the HR people feel can be good candidates for the on-site process. So then HR's job is to identify the candidate pools, whether that's working with headhunters or working with industry groups or universities and schools. And that's where they're going to go to screen candidates to invite them in for the on-site interviewers. Then the selected candidates that are going to be asked to come in for the on-site program, interview program, are going to be sent online assessments that they would take prior to their coming in for the interview. Then during this lull, the HR team can train the hiring manager and their team in behavioral interviewing. And then once the candidates are invited in, the HR staff host the candidates because they've been the people who were in primary contact with the candidates themselves, so they would make excellent hosts. Then the hiring manager and their team conducts 3 to 4 one-on-one interviews on the date that the candidates are invited in. And after the interviews are done, HR facilitates with the hiring manager and their team a review candidate by candidate, competency by competency, to evaluate the highest rated candidates. Then HR and the hiring manager would meet to conduct reference checks on a few items that they may have found in the interview that they wanted to further information on. And then HR would call the candidate to review with them verbally the offer and the timing and start date and that kind of thing. And the reason that's done verbally is if there are any questions or concerns or things that have to be changed, they're changed before the hiring manager issues a written letter with the offer in it. So the hiring manager calling first assures that if anything needs to be addressed or covered or changed, it can be done before the letter is drafted and goes out. And then the hiring manager in HR set up an onboarding and orientation program for the new hire. And they also, one of the most important pieces of the new hire orientation is they sit down with the new hire and tell them why they were hired. They review with them the competencies that they were looking for during the interviewing process. They review with them what they learned about the candidate and why they think they're a good fit. And they also review with the candidate any perhaps small concerns that they had, that they probably hadn't fully developed one or two of the competencies. But the feeling is in the next 3 months, they can learn those things pretty easily. So the hiring manager in HR set up the onboarding and orientation program. And as I said, they conduct the candidate review, tell them why they were hired. And then at the 3 month or 6 months after the new hire is started, they will probably run a probationary review or a first performance review. And then that is where the hiring manager and the HR manager sit down and they review what was predicted, what the candidate was told when they were hired and the reason they were hired. And we compare that with their actual performance to see if there are any variations. If there are variations, then that's feedback to the process, and the process may need to be altered or changed. Maybe the right competencies weren't identified in the beginning, or maybe the expectations of the level of the competencies weren't identified that well. At any rate, that's the opportunity for the process to begin to get some feedback. And that is what best practice selection looks like.